Hello, everybody. How are you today? Welcome to the Arts Funders Forum Remake the Model conversation series. Thank you so much for joining us today for our last conversation of 2023. My name is Melissa Cowley-Wolf. I am the director of the Arts Funders Forum and the founder of MCW Projects, an advising firm specializing in next era philanthropic strategy and organizational wellness. I want to thank our 2023 series sponsor for Remake the Model this year, Kickstarter. Wonderful to partner with you. Thank you very much for your support. And the Arts Funders Forum is a media platform focused on research, thought leadership, and convening, all in the name of advocacy. Our goal is to help increase private support for the arts and develop new models of impact-driven philanthropic support for the cultural sector. With a community of over 5,000 engaged philanthropists and funders, artists, cultural leaders, experts, and much, much more, our mission is to engage the next generation in cultural support and in advocacy. We launched in 2018 against the backdrop of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history. Younger generations are inheriting over $60 trillion, and that's a trend that's going to continue for decades to come. Our research indicates that those inheriting the wealth are turning away from the arts, and along with their new wealth creator peers, they do not consider the arts as essential. They prioritize social, racial, climate justice, education, and health. Simultaneously, the data shows that giving to arts and culture remains in a pretty perilous position at only 4% of overall charitable giving in the United States. So this is a massive problem to solve, and we at the Arts Funders Forum want to help you solve it. So to this end, we highlight new models that can expand the reach, the relevancy, and the impact of the cultural ecosystem. We look to thought leaders who invest in risk-taking, bold action, and seek to change the way that we do our business. So today, to end the 2023 series, I've invited a few such leaders to join us in conversation. Catherine, Mia, Lisa, Vincent, Jane, Gary, and Shaun are re-envisioning our models. They are blunt about what we need to do to achieve sustainability and resilience, and they offer insight into how to cultivate a new generation of cultural advocates. I'll be asking them to tell us what's on their minds right now, the trends they see, the challenges they see facing us, and to offer actionable solutions going into 2024. So while January 1st, 2024 is just another day on the calendar, for many organizations, it's the start of or the midway point of the fiscal year. So hoping you can strategize anew or pivot to respond to the trends and some of the feedback that our speakers offer today. But first, I would like to offer some thoughts of my own. We are living in a permanent change scenario. We're lurching from crisis to crisis, and we're being absolutely bombarded with information via technology. We know from these historical statistics, most recently during COVID, that giving to the arts is diverted during moments of extreme crises. Coming up in 2024 will bring us a US presidential election, continuing war in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and unpredictable economic outcomes. I work with clients to build resilient strategies in the face of this reality and could offer those prescriptions today. We could discuss AI, how it could ease the administrative burden of overburdened arts organizations. We could talk about expanding the notion of philanthropy, how we frame philanthropy. We could talk about building better and more innovative systems of measuring impact and outcomes. Yes, sure, but what I feel we need to do is we just need to listen to each other. We do not listen to each other anymore. And I mean really deeply listen, radically listen to each other. Listening to the person who serves you coffee in the morning, who checks you out at CVS, to your loved ones, to those you don't agree with. And for our work, listening to the cultural workers, the artists, the staff of the institutions, the advocates, and the audiences. Listen to what they're telling you and activate their feedback. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to speak with and listen to our guests individually, and then we'll come together for a quick group discussion at the end and take audience questions. So please submit those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, for that section of the talk. So I am excited to dive in. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Catherine Almonte, the Vice President and Global Head of Equity and Impact at Sotheby's.
Hi, Melissa.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for being with us today. So, Kat, you work at the intersection of art, equity, and community. You have robust cross sector experience spanning fine art, government, nonprofit organizations, and you've led these organizations through periods of complex transformation. Your work at Sotheby's is to lead the social impact efforts and a comprehensive endeavor to foster a more diverse and inclusive arts industry. Simple tasks you have there. So, from that perspective, I'm hoping you could tell us what is on your mind as we're wrapping up 2023.
Yeah, it was interesting because you mentioned kind of my social impact work and my DEI work as two lanes. But I think more and more I'm understanding them as one lane. I'm understanding that social impact in the arts has to be centered around DEI. I think a lot of us in the industry are aware of just the pervasive lack of diversity that is across our industry. And we really need to walk into 2024 thinking about what are real and often radical solutions to the exclusionary practices that have existed in the arts for so long. It has been in an industry that hasn't been welcoming always, that hasn't lent itself to different types of people feeling like this is a space for them. And so I think those are questions that we've been asking, but they're questions, but we haven't pushed for far enough, I don't think. And we really need to stop and think about the true causes of some of our problems, and in particular, what needs to change for more people to experience more belonging, both internally in terms of our teams, but also externally in terms of our audiences and our donors, especially as we look at, to your point, this next generation. I think there's that like 92% of young people say that a brand should be involved in supporting or promoting social causes. And for me, the major social cause of the art industry is DEI.
I love that. That last sentence there is pretty powerful. Can you give us some examples of the work that you do in order to advance this
Yeah.
um, from your platform within, one of the biggest and most well-known arts organizations in the world?
Totally. I think one of the big things is that we really need to redesign our pipelines and our entry points, and really think about how are we supporting this next generation of cultural workers. One of the things that we've done here is really take a look at our internship program, for example, which I think across the arts often has been filled by um, friends and family of our donors or so on and so forth. Often those internships are unpaid. And so it's the same people being brought in. And I think often what people are doing now is that they're saying, okay, well, let's have the diversity of our internship program reflect the diversity of, let's say, New York City. But I want to challenge you to actually have your internship program radically push towards having 60-70% of that class be from the communities that have been historically excluded from your institution. That's how you create balance. That's how you balance out the scales. We've been lucky enough at Sotheby's. Our team has really worked towards this. Our most recent internship class, 60% of our intern class was non-white. We've had 70% of our class identifies LGBTQIA, and so on and so forth. So we really are saying, like, how do we really balance out the scales in the other direction? The other thing that I'll mention, I had to tell a little bit of a story here, but I'm sure we all remember this moment. I used to work at the Brooklyn Museum leading government and community relations. And there was a moment for the museum when we hired a white woman to run our African art department, and the art world erupted. Erupted in a way that was really, I think, important. But it was a moment of reckoning. It was a big moment of reckoning for all of us. And I think one of the things that I learned from that is the position was funded by a donor. And often, these donations come with requirements. In this case, they require that the person have a PhD. And I think as donors, we also have to think about, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? It's hard to, when there's 2 people a year who graduate with an African art PhD in the world, if we really want a Black person, for example, to fill that role, which is what our communities were asking of the Brooklyn Museum at the time, we can't always mandate these same requirements. We have to think outside of the box. We have to change those expectations in order to broaden that pipeline. And so I think that's something else that we're looking at and thinking about more often is what are those ways that we can really break apart some of these like requirements for these roles. And I think the other thing that we're doing that's unique is looking at the art and objects that we at Sotheby's that we sell. I'm sure everyone has probably seen that the Met is returning 16 artworks back to Cambodia and Thailand because they were looted. Here at Sotheby's, we actually, one of the things that I did early on when I got here was start an ethics committee. And we're starting to take a look at the art and objects that we sell that have a history of violence or oppression or discrimination. How are we continuing to perpetuate those things within how we function as an institution and say, you know what, this is not okay. If we're not living our values in that way in terms of, the art that we have been tasked with stewarding, then I don't know that we can also change how we're looking at things internally.
Thanks so much, Kat. In the remaining minute we have, what's
Yeah.
something you'd like to leave our audience with today in terms of a first step they can take if they want to engage in this work? But they're kind of, it feels very heavy. It feels very, it's intense work. What's the first step you would say, or something to leave them with to get them started?
Yeah, I mean, I think that often we jump to solutions without really sitting with what is the problem. So I think people really spending 80% of your time thinking about what actually is the root of the problem. Why aren't, we often in DI always have these like goals or metrics or things we want to get to, but why aren't you getting there? What's keeping you from getting there? And really spending deep time exploring that in order to come up with real tangible solutions. I think, Sephora is in an organization I think I would point out that's doing incredible work. They realized that people of color didn't enjoy going to their stores, that their shelves were not filled with brands that were created by people of color. And so they've done a huge work in terms of shifting that. I think an example to share with everybody is their accelerator incubator program, in which they're investing deeply in women of color brands and lifting them up, giving them seed grants, giving them networking, mentorship. It's not enough to just have them on their shelves, but how are you supporting and really getting to the root problem of why there aren't enough beauty brands created by women of color. So yeah, just really reflecting on what needs to change in order for people to feel a bigger sense of belonging in your institution.
Thanks so much, Kat. Great to have you here. We'll see you in a little bit.
Of course, thank you.
Sure. And now I'd like to welcome Mia Locks. Hey, Mia.
Hi,
Read with us today.
for having me.
Yeah. So, Rita, you are a curator and the executive director of Museums Moving Forward, a data-driven research organization for equity in the art museum sector. I'm obsessed with data. I believe it's truly required to shift perspectives, change minds, and remake our model. Museums Moving Forward uses data, discourse, and empowerment to help museums move towards equity by improving the working conditions and the lives of cultural workers. This year, you released your report on workplace equity and organizational culture in U.S. art museums in order to create a field-wide view of the trends and the patterns in art museum workplaces and to help provide benchmarks for museums that participate in your work. So from this perspective, I'd love to hear what's on your mind.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, this was a big year for us. Museums Moving Forward really has been a staff-driven effort. It started with a number of colleagues, many of them curators, educators, and other cultural workers across the field, really starting in 2018, but kind of formalized in 2020. And 2023 was the year we became a nonprofit. But more importantly, we realized the impact we could make, which was to present this data in a way that we felt was a critical tool, but also a conversation that's really tough to have when it comes from the place of sort of anecdotal evidence. And we've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence, I think, over the last few years. You've seen an explosion of Instagram feeds and open letters and, workers sort of speaking out about what they're experiencing in art museums. But what we didn't see, and what MMF really is creating and is like nurturing, is a space to actually come together and co-design some solutions. I think I hear a lot in the philanthropic sector that the folks closest to the problems are often left out of the solutions. And that seems to be a shift also that we're seeing in the kind of zeitgeist. But our model is really designed to be that space where workers from different museums, from different departments, from all the kind of range of geographic diversity, generational diversity, et cetera, can actually come together and not only listen to each other, but work together to figure out what are some really concrete things we can do, or like what are the real sticking points that are happening that are preventing us. And I really appreciate some of the comments that Kat made just now about DEI and about the lack of diversity in the sector, because that's really what our research has shown. And one of the main focus points for us looking at 2024 is how to retain the diversity we have as a critical first step to expanding, to add more diversity, because I think those things really go hand in hand. So yeah.
Can you just name for us some of the key data points that came out of that study that would be most relevant, especially as they touch how donors can help reshape this and supporters can help reshape what's going on inside these institutions, really to reflect the attitude of the next generation, right? Which I spoke about at the beginning, is much more interested in supporting issues of social, racial, climate justice, and equity.
Yeah. So the report has kind of 4 sections of data, which I think is a helpful overview. The first is workplace culture. The second is career satisfaction. Those things are kind of related, of course. The third is on pay and promotions. And then the fourth is on discrimination and harassment. And, at a very high level, and I think honestly that some of the report has been framed somewhat negatively in the press. I think that might have to do with the fact that we as humans tend to focus on the negative. But by and large, we found the vast majority of museum workers, 82%, really believe that they're doing meaningful work. With that said, we compared the US art museum sector with US workers overall and found that US workers are more satisfied than art museum workers, which came out of conversation that we were hearing from folks about, oh, well, there's a whole challenge in the workforce in general. The museum field is just a kind of reflection of that. But actually, we found that art museum workers are more dissatisfied, and I can come back to that in a minute. But a couple other key data points that I think you don't have to be an expert to realize is somewhat alarming is that 60% of art museum workers are thinking about leaving their jobs, and it's actually 68%, which is even more, are thinking about leaving the field altogether. Largely due to low pay and burnout, but also lack of opportunities for growth. And that's pretty alarming if you think about how specialized some of these roles are, but also just what impact that could have on morale, workplace culture, those kinds of things. We found out a bunch of stuff about pay, which I don't think anybody would be surprised to learn, but the 3/4 of museum workers can't even pay their basic living expenses usually with their museum compensation. That actually includes even 29% of executives. And I think when you look at when you think about this from the standpoint of art supporters and funders and philanthropy, these are things that are hard not only to measure, but they're often hard to support in a really direct way. And some of the work that we're trying to do is to highlight some of the issues, as I mentioned, but to really develop some recommendations to work together to solve some of these issues. I won't say too much more about the diversity piece. I think we know that the museum sector is predominantly white at every level. That said, we did see the most racial and ethnic diversity, and actually the most diversity overall, 13 measures, at the entry level, which is important, which is why I was mentioning our focus on retention and specifically diversity retention, because it's not that the museum sector has a quote pipeline problem, which I think we've heard, or at least used to hear a lot, or I heard a lot, which was like, we need to internships are important. We need to, allow people opportunities. But what we found in our research is that we actually need to retain those folks, because what's happening is they are coming in and they are pretty happy and they're really excited to work at a museum. But something happens in the middle that they don't stay long enough to be eligible for leadership. So yeah, those are some of the like key points. And there's obviously much more I could say, but I hope that's a helpful start.
No, it's great. And I think, we're talking about something that traditionally donors have not been keen to fund, right? I mean, we unrestricted giving is, continuing to decline in many ways. The things that are the funding necessary to create and retain a diverse workforce, keep the lights on, et cetera, it's exceedingly hard to fund. And I wonder, and your work and your reporting goes into, and we've spoken about governance models as well. And to me, there seems to be a connection between how can we remake the governance model of our institutions to support this work that needs to be done from within. And if you have next generation donors who are fascinated and drawn to and want to promote equity in our institutions, getting them involved in a governance role, and then the workers and the staff members coming together, that we can co-create a new way of doing business and governing these institutions. And you have supporters out there who do want to fund this move towards equity and understand how that seed within the institution promotes equity overall. Can you leave us with some thoughts on how we can how we can remake these governance models?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a really complicated question. We are a new organization, so we had a clean slate, and we used that opportunity to try a pretty innovative governance model that we believe could be useful for others. I think it's going to be a hard argument to make to ask some place like the Met to change the way it does things tomorrow. But for us, one of the key ways for us to tease out some of these issues was to create a board, our board of stakeholders, who are our sole governing body that is entirely made up of museum workers. We have a separate entity called our Vision Council, who are kind of philanthropists, donors, museum supporters, many of them museum trustees, et cetera, across the country that really want to support this work. And they do so financially, and they sort of effectively underwrite what would otherwise be kind of paid board dues. We actually don't have our board pay anything. And in fact, we actually give them a small honorarium for participating and for their time and labor. So I think separating out the governance from fundraising is really key. And that's a much larger conversation, and it's complex, but it is one of the ways when you think about funding to support a museum doesn't mean you need a governing seat. And for some people, they may have really good expertise and the board, and they may need to be, and it may be useful for a director to have their leadership on the board. But I think in a lot of cases, if we're very honest, some donors don't need another board to sit on, but they're happy to support financially. And I don't think we necessarily make enough space for the kind of like very beautiful generosity of that. And one of the ways we think about it at MMF is this is an opportunity for a funder to sort of open an opportunity for somebody that works in a museum to get really hands-on experience to sit on a board, because some of the disconnect we've seen in the last few years, I think, is in actually a lack of understanding about how governance works, particularly in nonprofits. And so we're thinking of it that way too, as a way to kind of offer a certain sort of on the ground development and leadership opportunity for people that maybe have never had that experience before. So that's one thought. And then the last thing I'll say is on the governance, but also in the decision-making capacity and the co-designing and the kind of collective leadership. That's something that I think, generationally speaking, is sort of the moment we're in. People care just as much how we're doing our work as they care about the work itself. And so far, again, we see with our research that museum workers are really happy. They love museums. They love art. What is the really hard part is the way that we work tends to be extremely hierarchical, very siloed. Decisions are made and then sort of ordained across the organization rather than any sort of creativity about what it would mean to bring in some folks that are maybe dealing with that issue. And they may have really good insight. We don't see that happening a whole lot in the field. And that's, again, the way that we're modeled. So in a way, I'll just say that MMF is not a perfect place, but we are hoping that some of the work that we do can be the way that we can model some of the change that we'd like to see within our own sort of home institutions, if you will.
Thank you so much, Mia. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you later. And now I would like to welcome Lisa Greer. We don't have Lisa. Lisa seems to have dropped off. Let's see. Do we have Lisa? I think Lisa needs to rejoin the Zoom. So we will forge ahead and come back. We'll welcome Vincent VanVleet. Hey, Vincent, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I see Lisa's back. We'll do Vincent, we'll go to Lisa. Vincent, thanks for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. So as the executive director of the Phoenix Theater Company, you've guided a performing arts organization through a pandemic and the many, many, many headwinds that are facing the performance sector in America right now. You've led the organization through a successful capital campaign. You've built a 250-seat theater, and in early 2025, you'll be opening a 500 state-of-the-art seat theater there in Phoenix. So I'd love to hear what's on your mind and the advice that you have for organizations who are looking to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I thought about this, and I think there's been a lot of questions in our field of late, with a lot of organizations announcing cuts in staff and trimming of budgets. And we at Phoenix Theater Company haven't experienced the same type of downturn that I think our peer organizations have. So we really started to dig into the reasons why that is. And as I look at it, you mentioned, Melissa, at the top of this, that we're lurching from crisis to crisis in the arts, and I think from my perspective, I think we've lost our focus on the audience. I think they've gotten lost in the shuffle of all of the change that's happening in our industry, and thinking about how you put the customer back at the center of your model and create high personal touch experiences for them is really a way forward. We've been working on this for quite some time. We changed our business model, or started that change really incrementally, dating back to 2010. It was a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, and so we started building out a new customer service model and customer service platform that kind of culminated with a fellowship that I was on, in which I toured around the country, talking with major regional theaters and arts organizations about their best practices in converting transactional relationships into long-term loyalty. And from that, I was able to come back and invest in what is our patron concierge program, where we take our season ticket holders and they're given an actual person who takes care of them. It's their representative. So this person handles not just their tickets, but we also cross-train them to start taking their contributions and talking to them about contributing to the organization. So gone is the model of having two separate offices that you call to transact your business with the organization. It's this is prevalent in a lot of organizations, actually. I would say that you call the ticketing office to do your ticketing, you call the fundraising office to make your contribution, and they don't really cross over. And so we've kind of collapsed that model into one, so that you have one representative who is your representative for the theater, and they go out of their way to make your experience really joyful. They leave you seat back notes, they're giving private tours of the theater, and so it really gets us closer to that one-to-one model that we would want, that really then makes those folks feel more loyal to the organization, they're stickier to the organization, and they stayed with us. So we rebounded quicker coming out of COVID because of that closeness we had with our season ticket holders and donors.
It's so wonderful to hear that, because having spent 15 years in development offices at arts organizations, trying to create a institution-wide feeling of involvement and engagement and cultivation is not easy, because we like to silo everything up. So I love hearing how you retrained and trained folks to see that we all have a part in this. We all have a stake in the success of this organization. And just because we are not trained fundraisers doesn't mean we have, don't have extraordinary ability to connect with people. And the relationship is the most important part. So does it really matter who has it? Just let's train folks and let's do it. And I think it's such a wonderful way to think about that engagement and that personal connection, because the most important thing is the personal connection with the organization, right? And 3 people in a development office, 2 people in a development office don't have the bandwidth to do that. So I love that attitude of the retraining. I'd love for you to talk about the measurement of this, because I'm really interested in how you measure the success, determine the impact, and then reinvest it in it. And really looking at that data, that's something that, our industry, as I said, I'm data obsessed, really needs to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I had mentioned, this didn't happen overnight. This has been a 13-year journey since 2010, and growing incrementally, because most people can't just hire multiple people simultaneously. So what we did was we initially took our box office team, and that's where we kind of broke them up into 2 different groups. So we created a concierge office out of existing staff and then assigned them very specific portfolios of subscribers and donors that they then stewarded and curated. And we started tracking the increase in not just contributions, but also ticket sales, getting that kind of frequency of people coming back and bringing friends. In addition, how we were upgrading them in their contribution path with the organization. And then we were taking the revenue. We could literally see year over year the increase in revenue growth. And instead of letting those funds just go into the operating budget, we took those funds and sequestered them, and the following year reinvested in more team members to even build the model out even more. And so over the course or arc of the last 13 years, we've been able to build out a step-by-step process, a customer roadmap that is highly segmented, that has people in charge of each path or each segment of folks as they come into the organization and how they're treated. And that was put up against, I would say, taking control of the customer experience. I think a lot of organizations think of the experience starting when the proverbial curtain goes up. And that's not actually when audiences start their experience. They start the experience when they go to your website and buy tickets or make a contribution. And so we really started investing in what happens to them on that journey. So they buy a ticket, what happens to them in the parking lot? Who's greeting them when they're coming into the theater? What amenities are at the theater? Making sure that there are food and beverage options that are affordable for people to bring families to the theater, so they're not being taken advantage of once they're at the theater. And then, once they're in their seats, what's happening? And I suppose we maybe just expect the programs to be great, but the whole experience leading up to that moment needs to be exceptional as well. That will create retention and make people want to be part of your organization and come back over and over again.
I love it. Now, if there's people here on the call who are listening and say, that sounds great, how do we get started? What's one piece of prescriptive advice you could give the group, whether they're donors, board members, executive directors, fundraisers? What's a first step they could take to say, I want to do that?
Yeah, I would start small. I would start, with a customer roadmap, like what do you want to happen, and take a very specific segment. And start small and work on that particular segment. Or you could also, go to your box office and start cross-training folks on, taking contributions and, taking some of that burden off your fundraising office so that they have more time to spend with some of the other donors and patrons.
Love it. Vincent, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll stick around for the group discussion. See you soon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And congrats on all the great work. I'd love to welcome Lisa Greer, who is having some connectivity, but we seem to have Lisa back. Lisa, do we have you? Give it a second here. Yay, we have you. How are you? We have you on mute, though. Unmute yourself, please.
Hi.
There you are. How are you?
I'm great. After hearing Vincent's presentation, I'm even more great. I think that is so exciting. So
Good, right?
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, you are a fundraising coach. You are a major donor, and you're an author of a best-selling book. Here it is. I have it on my desk, called Philanthropy Revolution. And you also author a newsletter called Philanthropy 451, which I follow. It's a free newsletter people can sign up for. And you offer actionable solutions from a donor's perspective. And you get nitty gritty, which I love. And you say that you're on a mission to save giving by providing a clear path to success supported by data, statistics, and interviews. Yes. So we love data here, so I'm thrilled to dive in with you, Lisa. Lisa, currently as we're wrapping up this year, from a donor perspective, what is on your mind?
So it's very interesting listening to the other speakers because I think those issues are all pervasive and I hear about them all the time, and I'm frustrated that it's taking so long to make change. And which is why I was excited about Vincent saying, like, we're actually implementing these things. I think that the sector knows that change is necessary, but they're kind of stuck, and for a whole lot of different reasons, not for lack of trying, but there's institutions and there's other people and there's boards and there's all of that, and the way that these really nonprofits have been set up between the board and the volunteers and the donors and the big donors and the little donors and all of that is not conducive to the environment that the needs that we have right now to really change the way that that this is done, and the numbers that we're getting obviously make everybody nervous, and have been continuing along that trend. And I firmly believe that there's some very specific things that we can do to improve it and make it better, not the least of which is just being open to change. And if we can get to that point and say, yes, we have to change, then I really think that there's a lot of really good information out there and a lot of good research that will help guide us.
Thank you. I love it. And you are a donor and supporter of organizations across the nonprofit sector. So medicine, social services, politics, everything. Let's dive right in. Can you give me some of those actionable solutions that from a donor perspective, so what you see organizations are doing, other donors are doing, and what are the things organizations can focus on to usher in this change, and the advice that you have for them?
Great. Well, thank you for that. So there's tons of different things that can be done, but I'll focus on a few of them that I think are actually easy and typically don't cost anything, which I think will be music to some people's ears. So one of them, the most important theme over everything, is to just think of yourself as a donor. Everybody involved in the organization should think of themselves as a donor, because we all are donors. We're donors with different zeros, but we're all donors. Everybody has given something to somebody at some point in their life. It doesn't matter who they are. And to recognize that donors are not some alien being. Are there some donors that behave badly? Yes. Are there some fundraisers that behave badly? Sure. Are there actors who behave? Yes. So it's not focusing on them. It's focusing on the mass of the majority of people who really just want to do good. They want to partner with the organizations. They want to be involved with the organizations. They don't want to be treated like some people say a checkbook. That's kind of an archaic term. So they don't want to be treated like an ATM. And as soon as you think about how would if I'm a donor, and everybody thinks this, I'm a donor, how would I like to be treated? How would I do in that conversation? How would I do if I got that email? Would I open it? And when you start thinking of everything that way, a lot of the rest of it kind of falls into place.
I love it. And in your newsletter, you talk about this. You break this down. You receive these emails from organizations. They say this, and you're like, stop it. Stop it. Not, stop saying if you give now, you're going to save the world. Well, that's not necessarily going to happen. What's the other version of the argument? So in addition to thinking of yourself as a donor and putting yourself into that place, what are some other very specific things? You've talked before about the importance of recurring gifts. You've talked about authenticity. You've talked about surveying. And as I said at the beginning, my current thing is like, we don't listen to each other. So let's start there. How can organizations better listen to their audiences? And what is, as a donor, what do you want to be asked? And what do you want to tell these organizations?
Right. Thank you. So I want to be thought of as an individual. I don't want to be put into a pack of, oh, you are in this box, therefore you must think this and this, and it's having people make assumptions about me. I personally like to, as many, many, many new donors do, I like to be involved with the organization and to volunteer as well as give. And most organizations frown on that. They kind of say you have to do one or the other. So I think one of them is to really, and by the way, many, many volunteers, including most or a large part of young people who are starting to dip their kind of toe in the water about giving, will first volunteer for your organization to better understand how your organization functions and how people treat each other. So look to the volunteers, look to everybody who's associated with your organization as an opportunity and as somebody who wants to be engaged with. So one of the really cool ways of doing that is to survey you just mentioned surveys, to survey all of your constituents, to survey everybody who comes to your theater or your organization, who volunteers, who gives, who's on the board, and ask them just a few questions, very easy questions. The very specific thing I can give you is you can do this on SurveyMonkey. You can ask 3 or 4 or 5 questions, and it serves 2 purposes. The questions that I recommend you do, and I want to be very specific. One is ask them how they like to be referred to. People like to be referred to in different ways. I would prefer not to be Mrs. whatever Greer, whatever the name is. I would prefer to just be Lisa Greer. And so everybody has their preference. Everybody knows that answer. And it's so nice to be asked, because people then, you then feel seen. You feel seen as an individual, and that somebody really cares about how you as an individual feel. Another question is, how do you like to be thanked? Please do not assume that I would like to have, wait a month and then get some pretty letter or on nice stationery. I just want you to say thank you quickly. Please just say that. Some people say, I say 48 hours. Some people say 45 minutes. You just have to say thank you. And really, that's, again, common sense. Would you really want to wait a month to have somebody say so that it's something pretty? Most people would not. Ask them how often they want to be notified about your progress towards your mission. How about.
I just want to stop you there. You said progress, not news. And I want to differentiate that for the audience. Don't tell us all these programs you're doing. What is the impact you are making? What is your progress towards your mission, right? That's what you want to hear.
That's right. That's right. And so if you ask somebody, it will be very interesting. And this actually serves a lot of purposes. And people, you can do it just like any other email is done on the internet. When you're signing up for some email somewhere, it says, do you want to be notified about the news as it happens? Even though you're not telling them news, you're telling them progress. Do you want it to be hear once a month? Do you want to hear once a year? You will find that most people don't want to hear once a year. They would prefer to know as it happens. But when you do this kind of survey, you have actual information from a variety of constituents and a variety of people, and you'll start to notice trends, and you'll see, and the nice part of this is your boards and your other donors and people will see, we have X percentage of people really want to know about impact as it happens. X number of people really would prefer to get an email thank you note as long as it's fast, as opposed to wait and get something pretty. And then you can sort of rearrange the way that you do things based on that information. But the really special piece about this, in addition to getting the information, and then of course you must act on it the way that they ask. Don't ask somebody how often they want to be notified and don't notify them then. So you do have to make that change. But it makes your the people who receive it really feel noticed as individuals. And once that happens, they will automatically start to have a tie to your organization. And if they had a tie already, it's going to be stronger, because they feel like, oh, this is somebody who cares about me as a human, not me as somebody who's going to dictate whatever, just me as a human, just like them. And it is extremely powerful. And people I know who've done these surveys actually have donors. One of my favorite responses was somebody is they said, we didn't know that you cared. And I found that really, interesting and thought-provoking, right? And so you want them to feel like you care about them. Again, not in any kind of a weird power way, just as another human. And once you do that, all sorts of things will happen. Another piece is let your donors get involved in the way that they want to be involved. Don't tell them that you can't do this or you can do this or this is the way we've always done it. That's just not going to fly. One other quick thing is recurring gifts, I think, are really, really important. The research is showing that people who give monthly gifts are actually, over a period of even 3-4 years, give more money than people who give individual gifts. They also, and a lot of people think, well, monthly gifts are only for only for those people who give small amounts of money. And we have to stop doing that and saying, this is only for those people and this is only for those people. We're all in this together. So, but the recurring gift thing is people are much, much more sticky. And we know from tons of research that if you are a once a year gift, over time, most people know that they will give, that you try and get them to give more, but they start becoming less engaged, and over time they give less. And that's why you have this sort of 80% of people who don't give the second year. But recurring gifts are completely the opposite. So actually they show over a period of, I think, 3 to 5 years, about 90%, the percentage of people who are stickier, who stay with your organization, increases if they are a monthly donor. And one of the things people are concerned about is that monthly donors will not give that individual gift. And all the research shows they are much more likely to give a second gift, an individual gift, a solo gift during that same year. So the reticence against doing this just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think that's something everybody can implement.
Lisa, you're such a wealth of information and statistics. I encourage everyone to sign up for Philanthropy 451 and learn about your perspectives. You go into all this and more, and you can search in your database for these topics. Hopefully you'll stick around with us, Lisa. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And now I would like to welcome Jane Hait. Hey, Jane, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, of
Jane,
course.
you founded and you lead an organization called the Center for Art Research and Alliances, CARA for short, in New York City, and you're a supporter of many arts organizations throughout New York. CARA aims to create a future where an equitable and thriving cultural sector plays a critical role in the ongoing collective work of shaping a just and joyful, a word that's come up a lot today, society. You're very conscious of the work we need to do in the sector, but also how to align and connect with the general public and folks outside the sector. And you know that we need to do that in order to increase relevance. So I'd love for you to tell me from this perspective, what's on your brain right now and what advice do you have for our group?
Sure. So I guess I will say from listening to all of the brilliant speakers before me, definitely what I've heard and what I'm also thinking about is this idea of essentially how do we care for the team we have in place to if we're trying to diversify arts organizations, how do we make them be able to stay? And something I think that has been super informative for me in starting CARA, which was also started in shadow of pandemic. During the pandemic, it was the sort of 5-year research period that became an organization, sort of like a research project on the road to becoming an organization. But something that I think was a huge opportunity for starting an organization at this time, and I heard this from Mia too, in terms of museums moving forward, is it gave us an opportunity to say, like, okay, like there's reckoning with so many unjust systems. What does it mean to start something now, and what kind of systems do we want to not inherit, but try to sort of listen to sort of the needs of our community, and what kind of organization do we want to build? And something we thought a lot about, and this is like where I get super nerdy, is like human resources, honestly. Like, okay, well, like all the things that are super sexy about the arts, like exhibitions and artists and all these things, sure, but how, when we talk about creating a culture at an organization that is supportive, that's sort of people-centered, that puts well-being at the forefront, it essentially, like, where the rubber can hit the road is in human resource policies, right? So it's like, okay, like we need to rethink, to Kat's point about the barrier of a PhD in a job description, right? Like, well, so if someone feels that a PhD is a marker of a certain kind of sort of excellence, might we not say PhD or comparable experience? We know that there are so many barriers to getting those degrees, socioeconomic, racial, and otherwise. So thinking about how we write our job descriptions, thinking about the benefits we offer, the salaries we offer, and time off. Like at CARA, we did a sort of a big research in terms of the salaries and wanted to be sort of above average, in terms of the sector, but also thinking about, what do benefits look like? Where is our sector, for example, like failing to support parents, right? With really kind of paltry family leave, right? I remember hearing from a bunch of peers who were like of childbearing years and going through situations in their organization where I think they had like 3 weeks paid, and then the rest could be cobbled together. Basically like their maternity leave was like not getting fired, essentially. And I'm like, no, this is terrible. So how do you design, I guess, from the inside out, an organization that will sort of achieve your goals? Something that we've done at Cara since the beginning, or yeah, since for a couple years now, the organization is a little bit over 1 year old in terms of being open to the public, but we had a long gestation period. We have a weekly sort of like social emotional wellness check-in. I don't, because I'm founder and board chair, but the team does, led by our executive director, and just checking in like, okay, are we living our values this week? Did something come up where we felt like we weren't? Is there something we need to discuss? And then we have a handful of times a year facilitated discussion with an incredible facilitator we use, Corey Davis from Maven Leadership, who's incredible, who works with the team to sort of deal with how they're feeling as employees. How's collaboration going? How's the collective work? How are we doing like with our sort of organizational goals in terms of well-being? So I think that has been huge. That said, like, it's an organization like anything else. And just by virtue of living in this world, in this country, each of us as people like have a lot to like unlearn, let's say, that we just, because it's just like, for me, I'm a person who I do a lot of information gathering when I'm trying to build a process. And so I often will say like, well, how does one do this? How is it done? And then you of course have to be like, well, this is how it's always been done. Actually, this is like, we have to make some changes here because it's absolutely inequitable, or it creates a barrier or whatever. So yeah, I forget where I was going with that. I'll stop. Those are some initial thoughts.
It's great. It's great. I think I'm listening to you talk, and you're a seasoned donor. You support organizations throughout New York, and you've really built an organization based on what you want to see as a funder, right? And implementing the values that funders of your generation have. And you also, what I think is so amazing is you clearly acknowledge that this is a fundable strategy, that this type of organization has a place and can be funded for the values that you have. I'd ask you, to those on the call who either want to build those sorts of organizations or want to fund those sorts of organizations, what are some things you can tell them about how there is a place for this, there is value for this, and creating those people-centric organizations are exactly the type of organizations that the next generation wants to build? What's a step they could take in that direction in order to get some of that off the ground, or maybe implement that and appeal to those next generation funders?
Yeah, that's interesting. When you were phrasing the question, something stuck out in my brain, which you said you built an organization as a funder that you would want to see. And while that, I guess, is certainly true, because I am a funder, I also I would say, because I came to the organization from the position of having been sort of a cultural worker, someone working in that sphere, and having like a peer group that very much are sort of artists and art workers. I think I had both of those perspectives in mind, and I would say that like, ideally those perspectives can align, of course, not always. But yeah, like, what kind of organization would we want to work in? Would I be proud to be on the board of? And there are so many of them. And I think, organizations overall are doing this work. And at Cara, we had the luxury of not having to like unbuild a huge thing that, I often use I talk about, okay, like if you had to make changes at something like a MoMA or a Met, it's like would be turning the Titanic around midship. Titanic is probably not the right metaphor, but a large boat. You know, there's so much history and structures, and some of those structures work fabulously and others are harmful. So having you know, in some ways a blank slate, knowing that we all bring what we bring to organizations, that was fabulous. It was a real opportunity, and it was a hard one, but I wanted to say something else and now I've lost my train of thought.
It happens to me all the time.
Yes,
Hopefully you can hang out for the group discussion, find the
yes,
thought, and offer it up again. I'd love that. Jane,
for sure.
thank you so
Yep.
much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Appreciate it.
everybody.
And now I'd love to welcome Gary Steuer, the president and CEO of the Bonfils Stanton Foundation here in where I live in Colorado. Gary, how are you?
Hi, Melissa, I'm fine.
Thanks for being
How
with
are
us
you?
today. I'm well, waving
Good.
at
Well,
you up the road
thank
in
you
Colorado.
for organizing this great group of folks to be a part of.
A pleasure and an honor and a joy. You know, the foundation that you lead, the Bonfils Stanton Foundation, invests in inclusive, diverse, and equitable arts and culture and nonprofit leaders in order to create a thriving and just Denver. Under your leadership, the foundation has dramatically elevated its commitment to applying an equity lens to all of its operations, including its grant making and its investments. And through your grant making, your programmatic activity, and the community engagement that you do, you hope to inspire and cultivate an arts and culture sector that also embraces equity in their work. So from this perspective and your vast history and experience in the arts, tell me what's on your mind right now as we move into this new year.
Sure, thanks. No, vast history, gray hair. I've been doing this a long time.
That's good.
Public sector, private sector, all different layers of government, policy. So, you know, everything that all the other panelists were talking about really resonated with me, and I could probably go on forever just riffing on what they were talking about. I'll start by focusing on something that I think ties to the kind of remaking the model framing of these conversations, which is that I think institutional philanthropy is really set up or has been set up to support not-for-profit arts organizations. And we have to pivot to figure out how do we support individual artists. It is a cultural ecosystem that, yes, still includes wonderful nonprofit arts organizations, but it also includes individual artists who are part of the sector. And increasingly, I think it also includes entities that are not forming 501c3s, groups that are working through fiscal sponsors. There are still many, many funders that won't fund a fiscally sponsored project. Well, why not? Like, what are the objections to that? What are the challenges? How do we better reflect and better support projects that may not be choosing to work through a nonprofit model? And then also, how do we support kind of entrepreneurial creative activity? Because again, I think, and this for us as we've looked at the sector has been kind of particularly true of refugee and immigrant communities, where a lot of the creative energy, so if you're looking to be true to your equity values, the fact is a lot of our communities of color, and particularly when we look at refugee and immigrant communities, they're not saying, oh, I want to start a 501c3 arts organization in order to make my furniture or my clothing or my jewelry or my art. They're often doing it through entrepreneurial for-profit creative businesses. So I think we need to be looking at what we're doing with our corpus. I mean, folks like Edgar Villanueva has been a real leader in this, and many others sort of saying, what are you doing with the other 95%? I mean, institutional philanthropy foundations are sort of legally mandated to grant 5% of their assets each year. One, that 5% was intended not to be both a ceiling and a floor. So we have historically treated it as both. And I think funders have not, yes, many funders have mandates from their founders that they must be a perpetual foundation. But there are many, many foundations that have essentially made a choice to be a perpetual foundation. How do we re-examine that choice? And then the other is, what are we doing with our assets? If we have values, if we believe in values, if we believe in equity, are we ensuring that our assets are being invested with managers of color, with women? Because frankly, in the investment world, when you look at kind of ownership, women are as underrepresented as people of color in the finance industry. And so, we can speak with our assets, and then also looking at creativity and innovation, and what are we doing with our assets to invest in creatives. And so I think, those are, I think, things that are increasingly really, really important that we look at. And then I think also, and this sort of is connected to it, thinking about this as a larger ecosystem means that for arts and creativity to thrive, we need our big museums, but we also need the place for emerging artists. We need smaller galleries. We need organizations that are rooted in communities of color. And they have gotten statistically a very tiny percentage of institutional philanthropy. So I think we also need to, and again, not to abandon our big flagship institutions, they are really important, but I think they also have disproportionate access to high net worth individuals. And so I think there's a place for institutional philanthropy to look at how do we equitably support this cultural ecosystem, more small and mid-sized organizations, more emerging organizations. And I think that's really, really important too. And then the final point I'll make on this subject is also the critical importance of intersectional work, because we talked about the challenges of generational wealth transfer and the challenges that young people of wealth do not see the arts as something of interest to them. And I think part of that is of our own doing, and that we've defined the arts, frankly, in an elitist way. So young people associate the arts with black tie galas, with what their parents and grandparents supported. And it doesn't mean that they have to not be interested in the arts. They have to think about the arts in a different way. Arts without a capital A, culture, the connection between the arts and education and young people and climate change and equity in our community and understanding other cultures, mental health, the crisis in mental health and wellness. I mean, there were so many issues that the arts are critical to. And I think we have to do a better job communicating about that and reframing the arts not as being, the cherry on the top of the sundae, but being essential food that we need to nourish our souls.
Beautiful. I love it. I love what you said about, sticking with this concept of remaking the model. And you've talked about, funding for transition or funding for reinvention, right? And I think about that a lot as I see these statistics come out that trust in nonprofits is down. There's a lack of understanding among Americans of what the charitable sector is, what philanthropy is, what nonprofits do, what our business model is. There's a great study by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy that everyone can check out that talks about that in detail. But along with the rest of the world and institutions of every kind, there's a growing distrust in institutions. And so in order to stay an ecosystem, which requires diversity and collaboration and variety and equity in terms of how we support each other, we need to think about how these models can be different and how it's not just the nonprofit, but as you mentioned, direct artist support. And also you've mentioned that, and we know that next generations don't want to write, the check or Venmo money or make a transfer and have it just go into a big black box and not know what it is. There's, people want to invest their money for impact. They want to make direct equity investments and just different ways of doing business. I'm hoping you can leave our audience with a tidbit here. If they know they need to do this work, they know they need to really seed the ecosystem, right? And participate in that and promote that diversity. What's a step that our trustees on the call, that our executive leaders on the call, and that the cultural workers on the call can take to just move that needle a little bit within their own institution?
Well, I would say, sort of in keeping with the theme that a lot of folks have talked about, really kind of re-examining your model and not being afraid to implement change, to think about it. You know, if you're a theater company, to Vincent's point, how are you dealing with your patrons? What kind of relationship do you have with them? On the issue of engagement of donors and engagement of donors who may want to also be volunteers. They're at the front line. They're part of your customer service. That's wonderful in terms of donor relations, but can also be a double-edged sword in terms of your equity values if your donor base are predominantly white and come from a certain class, and you're trying to serve a broader audience, and they may not be as culturally competent. It doesn't mean you don't serve them or have them, but train them, have those conversations with them, make sure that they understand their critical role as part of your institution. And I think, if you're looking at the visual arts world and museums, and I gave a talk to the Museum Trustees Association not that long ago and talked about this, where, trustees in museums need to not be threatened by all of this change. They need to embrace it, because if museums are going to survive and thrive in the future, they need to not be just a repository of objects and a preserver of those objects, but they need to be porous. They need to be connected to community. They need to think about repatriation, not as a challenge or something they need to fight, but something they should embrace. And, looking at their own collections, it's certainly something, you're very aware. We've seen this here in Colorado with there was a reference to repatriation of, Cambodian and Thai art, and the Denver Art Museum has had its own reckoning around these issues. And then Denver Museum of Nature and Science as well returned many objects. And then also looking at who's in your collection, looking at if we want to attract audiences for the future and patrons for the future and younger patrons, they need to see themselves on the stage. They need to see themselves in the art that you have and that you're exhibiting. So it's not just about your internal operation. I think it also is about the art itself, and the art itself needs to be reflective of the community.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate you being here. We'll talk with you soon. Okay, last but absolutely certainly not least, Shaun Leonardo, artist and co-director of Recess. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. So your artistic practice is multidisciplinary. You deal with notions of achievement, collective identity, experience of failure. Your performance work is participatory and invested in a process of embodiment. And this comes out in the work that you do at Assembly, which is a diversion program for system-impacted youth at the arts nonprofit in Brooklyn, Recess, where, as I mentioned, you're co-director. I see your artistic practice actualized in your organizational work, and this is what I'd love to dive in with you today. So you've heard from these your fellow speakers, your great fellow speakers, on what the challenges we're facing and how to forge ahead. I think about, from my work in wellness, and where you and I talk and connect a lot, is how can we respond to all of this in our current permanent change scenario unless we're grounded and present and strategic? And so my question for you is really, how can we develop this healthy model for the arts, rooted in a somatic practice, to carry out the work and everything that your co-speakers said that we need to do? So what do you think? Where's your brain at with that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I think it's important to kind of name the terms and foundationally describe the issue a bit further. And, and for that reason, I'm really appreciative how this entire conversation has been framed around organizational wellness. And the fact of the matter is that the individuals who make up organizations are not well, which is then only compounded when we get together and attempt to exist in a mission-driven manner, in a humanitarian manner, however we might describe it. But that feeling of unsettledness, unwellness, that feeling of instability is only compounded in our inability to convene and to gather. And so I'll speak to the practice and sort of describe this a somatic approach to how we might gather in organizational terms in a moment. But I think what's interesting is that when we often start to look at organizational wellness, the issue is quite often described as the problem of hierarchical structure and the lack of decision and power flow, which is absolutely true. And then conceptually, it's often described as a values misalignment, which is also true. But underlying the structural and the conceptual is a relational problem. And just as you started, Melissa, the fact is that we do not know how to speak and listen. The irony is that we often consider wellness on an individual level as separate from the collective or the organizational. And so the practices don't often carry over into how we can actually hold one another and structurally and conceptually implement care on an organizational level. And I'm happy to get into things that we're experimenting now, but let me pause there to see if you want to respond in any way, Melissa.
No, you're on a roll. Keep going. Keep going.
Right on. Thank you. There are a few areas that we might consider this, and I want to echo so many of the things that the other panelists have brought up. From a board perspective, how do we start to consider that power space? What is otherwise really an acquisition and consolidation of power? It's a space that instead is one of co-learning and separating funding from a space that should be about support and accountability on an organizational level. One thing that we are soon to experiment with is actually naming roles within the board as necessary for that mutual learning space and as necessary for the impact that it might have in an ecosystem. And for that reason, thinking about an individual that is the carrier of restorative justice practices within the board. For our artists, we now have a care and capacity fund that really looks at the human being at the center of the projects that we're hosting and looking at what is the necessary practices, how is there built-in pause for that individual to consider themselves as an actor beyond production. And then for our staff and participants, we have an emergency fund that really attempts to cater to the precarity of urgencies that come up with overlapping systems that cause harm for our community, and having that at the ready to really support individuals urgently. And, more structurally among staff, really thinking about how do we build in the time to decompress and debrief together in such a way that allows us to call each other in, call out what has worked and what hasn't worked, and to move collaboratively, move collectively. None of what I've mentioned speaks to the somatic possibilities within those structures, those policies, those containers. And I know there's a lot of confusions in the ways in which soma and somatic practices have been misconstrued to think about anything that deals with the body. And really what I'm speaking to here are particular restorative practices that look at how power flows in a space and building an attunement to how we activate that power, oftentimes in harmful ways. And so one of the baseline practices that certainly I and many other of our artists and staff members try to instill in the space is a practice of co-regulation. How do you, in real physical space and time, try to regulate one another's nervous systems so that you're first seeing one another as human before attending to problem? And there are a number of ways that that can be experimented with. Certainly, there are movement-based practices. There are breathing practices. There are verbal prompts that allow you to call in person and as an individual first before thinking about structural issues. And I would say, as my, my final, offering before we move into maybe another question, is that this feels so necessary to me because from a power sharing perspective, what often happens and what we've seen in the field is that to attempt equity or structural change or workplace cultural change, what is developed are logistical or structural steps. But what occurs in that decision making, whether consciously or not, is a distance from those making those decisions from what is being implemented. And it is only through the somatic practice that each individual, the carriers of power, implicate themselves in the change, the necessary change. And so it's through proximity, it's through relationship building, it's through that listening, that hearing, that a different type of movement emerges. One that is more considerate of the human beings that make up the organization.
I'm just going to let that sit for a second. What you're talking about, and I think about this when I do executive coaching with leaders of cultural organizations. I think about it when I walk into a yoga class to teach. You see in the body, and you see on the face, and you hear in the voice a tightness, a rigidness, an exhaustion, a hardness, right? And when you're talking about power sharing, equity, space change, structural change, it all requires a vulnerability, right? How can we be vulnerable when our bodies are tense with stress, our minds are full of to-do lists and stress, and we're bombarded by these images from all over the world? We are these containers of such frantic, frenetic energy. You cannot make structural change from that place. You cannot share power from that place because you can't even look at yourself. And if you can't be in your body and know where you're at, how on earth are you going to do anything with anyone else or help anyone do anything, right?
That's so absolutely true. Melissa,
And
folks
the
are so dysregulated.
Yeah, we are a dysregulated culture, right? Can you, I want to bring everyone back here in a second to respond to each other and some audience questions, but can you leave us, and I think people are going to go back and rewatch this a few times, but can you leave us with an example or an exercise or something that we can all do as cultural leaders, as trustees, as executive directors, as fundraisers, as artists, before we walk into a room with our colleagues this afternoon? What can we do to bring ourselves back into regulation?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. So I'm gonna offer you a bit of a precursor to that to that offering. And just to piggyback what you've said, Melissa, when we've been conditioned, and this goes for across organizations, so horizontally and vertically, when we've been conditioned to maintain status quo, change lands as a threat. And so from the source, we are dysregulated. We believe that those we are in partnership with, for some reason, are a threat to our position. And so inevitably, our humanity and that of the person that we're trying to exist with, convene with, and make change with, the first thing to go is our sense of humanity. So with that in mind, what I often attempt for myself and then will share with everyone else in this virtual land is, before you step in the room, imagine the better outcome. Take a moment to breathe and visualize the better outcome, because we so often step in anticipating the worst. And allow yourself to breathe into possibility before even saying a word.
I love it. One of my teachers, Lizzie, always says, live in the energy of the wish fulfilled, right? Live in that energy. Shaun, thank you so much. I want to bring all our speakers who are still with us back and open up the floor for any of you to respond to each other, to respond to what you've heard most recently, to respond to anything you've heard on the call, and any last words you'd like to leave with our audience. And I'd like to thank our audience for sticking with us. I'm usually a stickler about ending in an hour, but it's the end of the year. We got a lot to talk about, and these people are far too smart to cut them off. So anyone want to jump in? Gary.
Yeah, well, I'll just reinforce, because it came up as a theme, the critical importance of looking at pay equity, benefits, family-friendly work environments, human-centered work environments. I think, ironically, the arts, which are about humanity, have often been awful in terms of how we treat our people. And as a funder, you know, we've gotten better at asking questions around equity, diversity. What does your board look like? What does your audience look like? Your artists look like? And, you know, even speaking for ourselves, we don't necessarily ask tough questions about what are your pay scales? What are your benefits? What are your family benefits, family leave benefits? All of those sorts of things, which I think are really crucially important in terms of the issue of burnout, the issue of keeping people in the sector. And these are things that I think cut across disciplines, cut across size of institution. And it means sometimes making tough calls. It means doing one fewer show if that would mean paying your team better. And I think we have to look at that, and we tend to be driven always by the art. And we, you know, as if investing in our people is taking away from the investment in the art. And I think we need to look at those things as not separate, but as unified.
And isn't that an art too? Right? Investing in your people, isn't that an art? I mean, that's going back to Shaw. That's a lot of what his practice is. You know, Gary, you say that, and yes, this reckoning is happening, largely driven by cultural workers and the cries for equity, but also, as we all know, next generations of funders who want to invest and make transformational change with the wealth they've created or inherited are asking these questions. Where is your endowment invested? How do you pay your staff? What are your leave policies? Everyone's nodding. They want to know that before they come to anything, volunteer for anything, or give anything. And if they don't see that, they ain't showing up, right? And so time is of the essence to respond to this, not just because it's morally correct and it will ensure sustainability and resilience, but also because the people that we need, given the system that we have to support us, it's a non-negotiable. It's really a non-negotiable.
I just want to offer, in connection to what you just said, Melissa, particularly because I have to jump in just a minute. You know, we from a fundraising standpoint, organizations that are trying to move through change, we have to have some understanding that that is process. And so therefore, to allow for failure, we often see, I should say, I'll speak for self, that the experience of the philanthropic relationship is that the thing, equity, should be polished and complete when presented. But so much of this work, the messiness of it, needs to be protected. Aspects of it must be invisible to a larger public and certainly to funders. And much of it can't let the funders in. It needs to be contained and worked through, not without accountability, but certainly to allow for a process that is willing to build in failure. And so in relationship with philanthropic organizations, how are you allowing for the work to be done in such a way that it's not privileging you, the funder? That the experimentation is protected and kept as crucial, not in response to dollars, but in response to your belief and trust that the work is happening the way it needs to happen.
I was taking a look at, thank you, Shaun. I was taking a look at the questions here. Any last thoughts? Christina asks us a question. As someone who's tasked with fundraising and also sits on the board, can I make an appeal to get rid of the concept of give or get? I don't want to be part of an organization that speaks this way to people who want to help but can't give money. Any thoughts on the give or get and the equity within our board structure?
I could say that we modified our policy to a give, get, spend. We have a lot of young board members that like to create community-wide events. So they participate by organizing large groups of people to come to events and shows at the theater. They host like happy hours at our bar. And so that's the way that they're participating, by bringing other people into the organization as an ambassador to the organization. And that has been really, really helpful to us in attracting people who can't personally write a check and don't necessarily have the network of folks that can write those large checks. And that has been just, it's really helped us cross that divide.
It's great. Well, it's friend raising, right? And you're investing in the future. All of those people might someday be able to write you a massive check or give you, as going back to Lisa's point, $10 a month for the next 50 years. That's huge. It's huge. And so don't say, I think it was Lisa or Jane, I forget who it was, who said, don't just say, Lisa, don't just say no to the donor's idea. Really think about it and figure out how to make it work. There's some stuff that just, maybe falls outside of scope of mission. But if it falls within scope of mission, how can you get creative with it? So Vincent, thank you. I want to give everyone the chance to offer up any closing thoughts. Vincent, Kat, Lisa, Gary, thanks for sticking around. Shaun had to jump. Any last thoughts for our audience who is still here with us today? And for those that will listen to this on a recording that you have, given that you've heard each other speak. Okay.
I think
Thank
Lisa's
you.
saying something. She's on mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, comment about the get piece. So I completely agree with Vincent about the ambassador thing. That's the word that I usually use. But it's important that it's not just the way that give or get kind of resonates with people is who aren't used to that. It's just sort of like what I saw somebody wrote in the chat, like, just get out, or if you can't do this or whatever. But there are so many ways that people can do the get part. And maybe there needs to be a better word for that. But there's so many ways that as younger people, newer donors, people who can't afford, and I'm not saying young people can't afford it, but there's older people who can't afford it. You don't know, but there's something that they can contribute both to the board and to helping with fundraising. And that doesn't mean asking somebody for money. It can mean a million different things in terms of bringing friends to the organization, inviting people to events, whatever it is. When I say events, I don't mean galas, but actually bringing them together with your organization, letting them know what's going on, letting them know that $5 a month or coming here and there is actually, you're thrilled with it. It's a wonderful thing, not looking at it with disdain. I think that's really important.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. This was really a joy and honor to be in conversation with you all. Kat, Mia, Lisa, Vincent, Jane, Gary, and Shaun. Thank you for your generosity of time and energy. And I just want to acknowledge the incredible work that you're doing for the sector. Thank you so much. I also want to thank today's event producer, Hadley Mitchell of M+D, the Arts Funders Forum Advisory Board, who provides incredible counsel to our platform, our sponsor this year, Kickstarter, and to my Arts Funders Forum partners, Sean McManus and Brett Dobbs. I want to thank the audience again for joining us today and throughout the year. Thank you so much. And stay connected with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or over email at info@artsfundersforum.com. And I want to wish everyone a peaceful, a healthy, and a grounded holiday season. and a joyous and peaceful 2024. Thank you all so much. Happy holidays. We'll see you soon.
Same
Thank
to
you.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you all.